Hey guys, Political Junkie 2414 here, and welcome back to another video. Today, after much delay, I'm going to be finally updating my 2024 Senate prediction for the month of March. I made one last month. I think I looked back at the date, it was February 4th today. As of I'm recording this, it's March 17th. I've just been dealing with a lot as usual in my personal life, so um, I have had a hard time trying to figure out when I'll have the time to make one of these videos. But I have found that moment and I feel compelled to do it. A lot has changed about these Senate races. I've been doing my best to keep up, and I'm going to share a few of my thoughts about each of these races. And so, yeah, these videos can take a pretty long time. I usually take like several minutes to get started, just kind of giving an overall background. But I'm going to just kind of get into it, just so that I don't waste any time. So we're going to fill out the safe Democratic and Republican states. California, I will say, did just have their primary. Their all-party Senate primary. It's going to be it's going to be Adam Schiff, the Democrat, versus Steve Garvey, the Republican. Katie Porter and Barbara Lee, the other two Democrats running, did not end up advancing. So Democrats will not have to worry about, um, uh, you know, a, an intra-party fight that would suck up a lot of the fundraising oxygen up through November, which could have hurt Democrats in some of the House elections in California, which are critical to taking back that House majority. So thankfully for them, they were not able. The Democrats were not forced into that scenario. So Schiff will easily win that race, but it was a pretty interesting one to watch. Anyways, getting back on track, Minnesota. This Amy Klobuchar probably will definitely outrun Biden. I think that she'll win by around 15, 16 points, maybe pushing 17, 18. But mid-teens, it'll be her closest win. It'll be closer than her win in 2018. Then we go to Delaware, New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, New York, and Maine. Vermont and Maine have independents, Bernie Sanders and Angus King caucusing with the Democrats, but they are both, you know, they both count technically. They are, members of the Senate Democratic Caucus, as I just said, and they count as Democrats in the overall Senate makeup. So, and Maine, Angus King is he leans more liberal, as I just said, but he is an independent. Maine loves their centrists. They have Susan Collins, a Republican, as their other senator. One of the few remaining cross-party or crossover senators from a pretty partisan state. I mean, Maine is not solid blue, but it's not necessarily what I'd call a battleground state. So, yeah. So that's it for the Democrats. For the Republicans, we have Utah, Wyoming, Nebraska. Nebraska actually has two special elections, or two Senate elections: North Dakota, Mississippi, Tennessee, Indiana, and West Virginia. West Virginia, for a while, was thought to be going to be one of the key races for the Senate majority, and it is in a sense still because it holds an automatic pickup opportunity for the GOP, which they're almost certainly going to get now that Democratic Senator Joe Manchin has confirmed he's not running for re-election. I've heard that Chuck Schumer is trying to convince Manchin to reconsider and run as an independent candidate. Manchin has not completely ruled that idea out, but he said it's very unlikely, and I'm going to take his word at face value. I believe that he is not going to be running for re-election. I think he would lose anyway to Jim Justice, who I think is very much likely to be the Republican nominee. I think he'd lose to Alex Mooney, the other likely candidate for the other top contender for the GOP nomination. But either way, with Manchin out of the race, any chance the Democrats did have of holding on to West Virginia in a presidential election cycle when Trump's going to win it by an overwhelming amount just faded into nothing, or just dropped to zero. So West Virginia going to go to Republicans, certainly. at this point. So that brings Democrats to 40 seats, Republicans to 47. This is where you start to kind of see the Democrats are defending a lot more territory because their natural number, not only with the safe state or with no states filled out, but with the safe states, Republicans are already almost um, winning or almost have already secured all of the states that they are up for re-election in. There are only three other seats that they currently hold up this year that we have yet to characterize. And we'll go into the likely states now. These ones are not going to necessarily be the most competitive, but they do have a chance of becoming more competitive. It's a likely range, or it's a wide range of in terms of margin, the from 5 to 15 points for either party. So some will be a lot closer to being battlegrounds than others, and we'll talk about that especially for some of the Democratic states here. Um, I guess we'll go from west to east. New Mexico. This one I had a lot of personal deliberations over. I thought maybe moving it back up to safety was appropriate, but Martin Heinrich, while he is a very strong incumbent, and I have no doubt will win re-election, New Mexico doesn't usually vote for Democrats by safe margins. It's still a very blue state, but it's not a it's not a safe blue state. Heinrich really benefited. I'm from my memory. Actually, we can check. New Mexico did have a three-way race in 2018, and Heinrich, while I'm sure he would have won some of the libertarian vote that Gary Johnson gained, um, and I'm sure he would have won by a safe margin given the national environment. I don't think that that's obviously not going to be the case this time. He's running against Pete Domenici, the former GOP senator from New Mexico's daughter. Um, and so I think that, oh, excuse me, I don't know what that was. Something came up in my throat. Um, But I think that, coupled with the fact that New Mexico just never, or almost never, votes for Democrats by safe margins, even though it's a very reliably Democratic state, is going to um, be in the likely column. I think Biden or Heinrich does slightly better than Biden, but not by much. So yeah, but I think it's a real big reach for this NRSC, the Senate Republicans campaign arm. So yeah, I don't think that New Mexico's one to really keep your eye on. I just wanted to list it as likely. Missouri, this one is kind of in a similar sense or fashion to New Mexico, is going to vote for the Republicans. It's kind of the inverse of New Mexico if you think about it. Um, Josh Hawley, who beat Democratic incumbent Claire McCaskill in 2018, is going to win re-election once again. The Democrats are putting a lot of momentum behind Lucas Kunce, their presumptive nominee, and in 2022, Democrats actually had a decent cycle in Missouri, even though they didn't really win a state race. They did only lose the Senate race by 13 points, which was a um and it's not like the Republicans nominated a more controversial candidate. Eric Schmidt was a safe choice for the Republicans. If it had been Eric Greitens, that would have been one thing, the disgraced former governor, but it was not. And Hawley has definitely, I think, alienated some suburban voters who may have been more open to voting for him in 2018. Although I imagine most of them still voted for McCaskill because she was the incumbent and she was very popular, or I don't know if I'd say she's very popular, but um she had a history of winning in the state by, really big margin or by comfortable margins. And so now that Hawley's the incumbent and it's a presidential year, it's just there's no reason for Democrats to be putting um any money behind Lucas Kunce other than just a sentiment against Hawley. But yeah, that's really it. Uh I think he wins by 12 to 13 points, and I think Heinrich wins like 12 to 14 for the record in New Mexico. Going down to Florida, we have the incumbent Republican there, Rick Scott, running for re-election, the former chair of the NRSC. who received a lot of criticism and faced a potential primary challenger, though that has really evaporated. The chances of that have dropped to none by this point. He is going to be the Republican nominee. Democrat Democrats kind of over the summer found um, a decent-ish candidate in Debbie Murkowski Powell. I'm sorry, I do not know what's going on with my voice today. Um, but yeah, usually I record these a little bit later in the day. It's about 11 o'clock when I'm recording this right now. But anyways, Debbie Murkowski Powell, a former congresswoman, she's got the Democratic Senate campaign arms backing, and she's a decent candidate. But Florida has just moved so far right. It's not a safe red state yet, but certainly not as competitive as it used to be. It's going to vote for Trump by a sizable amount more than it did in 2020. It won't be a DeSantis plus 20 margin or a Rubio plus 16 margin type for Scott, but or for Trump for that matter. I think Scott, for the record, underperforms. Um, I think Scott does underperform Trump by 1 or 2 points, and but he wins by around 6 to 7. I'll be right back. Sorry about that. Something was just something just came up, but I'm back now. Anyways, yeah, Scott wins by around 6 to 7 points. Florida, again, a big reach for Democrats. Not as big as Missouri, but still, um, one of their only like reasonable pickup opportunities, much more attainable than Missouri, but still, as I said, likely column is it's a big range of outcomes. So then we go to Virginia. This is Tim Kaine's Senate seat. He's running for re-election. He won by 16 points in 2018. In fact, we'll pull up the Yap Mems map for Senate. Yeah, Kaine won by 16 points here in 2018. 16, should I say. And so he's going to win by a lot again. Virginia, while not a solid blue state generally, still elects Democrats. It did have a good Republicans did win, of course, in the 2021 statewide elections. Of course, Senate elections are technically statewide, but of course they're federal offices, so bit of a distinction there, more than just a bit. But Kaine is um, known to overperform other Democrats. He was the former governor of Virginia, um, and he is the former governor of Virginia, um, and he's won 2 Senate races, and overperformed his Democratic counterparts both times. Um, and so I think while Republicans have a decent candidate in Hung Cao, who's likely to be the GOP nominee, they're also talking about Scott Parkinson, who was the vice president of the Club for Growth, which is a very right wing um, group of people. I think either way, Kaine's just I feel like it's a bit of a stretch to call this a safe race just yet. But um either way, I do not think Republicans will be pouring a lot of money into this. I think Kaine wins by around 12 to 13 points, in a similar fashion to New Mexico, or Martin Heinrich in New Mexico. Um, but ironically, I think the race that, while in terms of margin, will be more solid for Democrats slightly, but has more potential to become competitive than Virginia is Maryland. This is a change, and so this state for a while was considered, despite the Democratic incumbent Senator Ben Cardin retiring, to be a safe blue state. However, Republicans at the last minute convinced the former Republican governor Larry Hogan to run for Senate, which changes the dynamics of this race pretty drastically. Now, Senate races are not governor races. I want to make that very clear, and I don't think Hogan is going to win. I think that he is going to overperform Donald Trump in this state by a considerable amount. However, I do not think he's going to be able to overcome that massive 30-point margin that Trump is inevitably going to suffer in this state. I think that, you know, the likely Democratic nominee at this point is David Trone, although that's a very um, divided primary for the Democrats. I could also see it being Angela also Brooks. In general election polling data, like Trone does tend to perform better, which many people have attributed to his ability to self fundraise. Personally, I would say Trone is probably a better candidate against Hogan than Alsa Brooks, but of course, I don't think it's a I think both have their benefits. Also, Brooks would be able to help with African American turnout, and I don't think that Hogan would beat either of these candidates. I think he has a lot of potential to make this race competitive, and I think the main um, benefit of him running in this Senate race is that it pulls away Democrats' ability to focus on more competitive Senate races in the Rust Belt, in the Sun Belt, and of course Montana, which all of which are they really need to win, or the vast majority of which they need to win in order to keep their Senate majority, and that's assuming that Joe Biden also wins the presidential election. Democrats don't have a lot of room for error in this Senate cycle. The good news for them is that the Republicans have made it so made it so difficult for themselves to win because they are just putting up terrible candidates overall. Although this Senate cycle, Larry Hogan, I think it was definitely their best find. I was very surprised when I heard that he was running because he had ruled it out in 2022. He was very adamantly against running previously when asked about it in 2024. But either way, I guess something in his mind changed. So yeah, and that's a big development on for this race. But overall, I still think that whoever's the Democratic nominee, whether it be Trone or Alsa Brooks, um, is going to win by double digits in this state, just by a lot less than is typical for a state as blue as Maryland. Then we go up to Pennsylvania, our final, actually, it's not our final likely state, but it's almost. Um, Bob Casey is the Democratic incumbent here. He's won three comfortable victories before, and he's going to, I think he's very likely to win re-election. I have a really hard time seeing how Republicans can win this Senate race. However, this is still technically, I mean, Pennsylvania is still a very competitive state, just generally in American politics. Um, and I think that Casey, even though his family's is a political dynasty in this state, I mean, he's not going to win by a safe margin like he did his first Senate race, but nonetheless, he's going to overperform Joe Biden by quite a bit. He's going to make it very hard for Republicans to win this Senate race. However, the good news for the Pennsylvania Republicans is that they have coalesced around a candidate. Who is that candidate? Well, it's David McCormick. If that name sounds familiar, it's probably because you remember him from the 2022 Republican Senate primary, which he lost by just under 1,000 votes to Dr. Oz. Now, McCormick has a lot of similar issues to Oz. He has a carpetbagger problem, in the fact that even though he was born and raised in Pennsylvania, or at least born in Pennsylvania, he has spent most of his life in Connecticut, um, which is farther away from Pennsylvania than New Jersey. Also, he's running against a Democratic incumbent, and while yeah, I think what people have to remember is that McCormick was better than Oz and Kathy Barnett, especially by comparison. The GOP Senate field in 2022 for Pennsylvania was so bad that McCormick was just the least bad. He's not a terrible candidate by any means, but I think he's gonna make Democrats spend money here. But I mean Pennsylvania is just a naturally competitive state anyway. Um, and Casey is an above average Democrat. So chances of it going red, Pennsylvania going red, not very high, but it will definitely be a race to watch. I am interested to see how much Casey wins by in November. Currently, I would say if the election were held today, he'd win by around anywhere from 7 to 9 points. We'll go with 8. Now, the final likely state for the Democrats before we move on is Wisconsin. Wisconsin is a state that for a while I was reluctant to put as likely Democratic. I think most people got on that bandwagon maybe August, September of last year. I was really resistant for a while because Wisconsin, Tammy Baldwin is a very strong incumbent. Um, and I think a lot of people underestimate her in that sense, and Republicans just really have dropped the ball. This has probably been their worst the worst battleground state this cycle for their candidate recruitment. Ability. They really just could not find a really decent candidate. They had to go with Eric Hobbs, who is a hedge fund manager. He ran for Senate in 2012, and he has come out as kind of a little controversial. He's kind of got a similar carpetbagger problem to McCormick and Oz, in that he's a rich billionaire from who's lived most of his life in California, from what I can tell. Um, you can read. I won't go into the details about some of the stuff. Some of the silly things he's done. But anyways, just keeping on track here. Baldwin won in 2018 by an 11-point margin, overperforming the Democratic nominee for governor, Tony Evers, by like 10 points. And again, Evers was running against a Republican incumbent and is very and was run and governor and Senate races are very different. But Baldwin also won in 2012 against former Republican Governor Tommy Thompson, who did have a bruised primer, who was really damaged by a competitive primary, to be fair. But overall, I still think that Baldwin has proven herself to be a very formidable Democrat. And Wisconsin Democrats, in a similar all across the Rust Belt, really, Democrats have been doing incredibly well since 2018. Really have built, in a sense, really built back the blue wall in some of the as suggested by some of the election results. And that doesn't really mean that Republicans can't win these Senate races, but I think and they certainly can win these races on the president in the presidential election. Um, but I think Baldwin has really Democrats have just seen a lot of success in Wisconsin with Tony Evers winning re-election in 2022, which shocked many people, including yours truly, um, as well as uh, let me think, as well as Ron Johnson winning, underperforming the polls and only winning by about 1 point, his closest election yet to Mandela Barnes. Who was one of the weaker Democratic candidates that cycle. Um, and I mean, I know that a lot of people, I don't think he's as bad as some people say he was. I will admit, I really trashed on him in those last couple months of the campaign. However, he just had a really bad reputation, and that really led to his downfall, I think. Um, however, um, I've lost my complete train of thought. Even if Republicans get someone like David Clark, who is the former Democratic sheriff of Milwaukee County, I think he'd honestly be a worse candidate than Hobbs. So I think Baldwin wins just barely above 5 points. Um, she's like, I really think that um, Casey and Baldwin um, should feel really comfortable about their races, regardless of how the presidential election cycle goes for Joe Biden, especially if Trump is winning these two states, um, which I don't think Trump is going to win the presidential election at the moment, for the record, which is a controversial opinion. He absolutely could, though. But I think that these Senate races, are going to be a lot better for Democrats. I think that I think Baldwin and Casey should feel really good about their reelection odds. Anyways, now we get down to the last 6 states. These are going to be the states that really decide the Senate map: Nevada, Arizona, Texas, Montana, Michigan, and Ohio. So we're gonna go from where do we start? We usually go west to east. Um, what am I gonna do today? How am I feeling? Uh, you know what? We're gonna go from east to west. So we're gonna start off with Michigan, which I'm gonna put as a lean Democratic state. So, this is probably Michigan generally is the bluest of these free Rust Belt states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. However, it's this cycle Democratic incumbent Senator Debbie Stabenow is retiring, and Republicans actually don't have, they've kind of started to clear up that messy primary that was consuming them for a long time. Mike Rogers got Donald Trump's endorsement the other week. James Craig, who was another front runner, the former 2022 candidate for governor of Michigan, dropped out because he was really struggling with fundraising. There has been a new candidate to replace him, however, former Representative Justin Amash, who was a critic of Donald Trump and briefly became an independent before deciding not to run for re-election in 2020. Yada, yada, yada. There's also Peter Meyer, who is another anti Trump Republican. Rogers, though, has the NRSC's backing. He has Trump's backing, several GOP senators backing, and he honestly is not that bad of a candidate. He was a former chair of the House Intelligence Committee. He also won. I think he represented the same district that Slotkin is currently representing. Elisa Slotkin, who's likely to be the Democratic nominee. Um, she's really coalesced a lot of support in the primary. Hill Harper was for a long time thought to be a serious contender. I thought that he had a chance for a while too, but Slotkin really does seem to have coalesced support and is the clear favorite now. Which I never really had any doubt, but I she really is looking like she's almost guaranteed the nomination. And so I think that this race, while it's going to be the closest of the free elections, or of the free Rust Belt states for the Senate elections, it's still going to vote Democratic. Republicans haven't won a Senate race in Michigan since 1994. That was 30 years ago. And while Democrats can lose Michigan, and I think it's more likely at the presidential level, Slotkin's a decent candidate. She's not perfect, but she's won in a competitive battleground district before, so has Rogers, to be fair. Um, but it's going to be an interesting race. I think that this is one that's really evolved. I will say, since my first prediction for the 2024 Senate elections, uh, back in like December of 2022, my the predicted I thought that the GOP was going to have the GOP nominees for Senate were going to be basically different people in almost every single race. The only a couple races have not changed in terms of who I expected to be the nominees. But Michigan, I think, votes for Slotkin by around 2.5 to 4 points. Um, very much within reach for Republicans, but not their best chance to pick up a Senate seat. That is for sure. The best one in these free Rust Belt states, though. Ohio, though. Ohio holds its primary on Tuesday, and it is the Sherrod Brown, of course, is going to be renominated as the Democratic nominee. He's a very strong candidate, will overperform Joe Biden for sure, and but he does face a serious problem with polarization in a presidential election year. While he has been able to win free elections in the past, Republicans are really gunning for him this time. Not that they hadn't before, but in 2018, Jim Renacci really kind of collapsed. His campaign kind of collapsed by the summer, and Republicans pulled out of it because the Senate map, of course, they didn't need Ohio. They were dealing with other Democratic incumbents in redder states like Indiana, Missouri, North Dakota, and Texas. Or also, they had to defend Texas and Tennessee, which were very competitive states. And also they had races in Nevada and Arizona to compete. The Senate map looked different back then, even though it's the same, like, overall class. And so This time, Ohio is going to be more competitive. Trump is going to win this state by, at the very least, 6 points. At the most, probably 12 or 13. If it's on the higher end, I think Brown is going to have a really hard time over performing Joe Biden by enough. He's going to outrun him no matter what, but of course, the math has to be possible. So Biden has to not lose by a landslide in Ohio. He has to lose by a relatively small amount. And I say relatively in, air quotes. Um, but Republicans just have the primary in Ohio is one where the NRSC did not intervene this cycle. Um, this is the one where Steve Daines, the campaign armchair for the GOP on the Senate side, decided to stay out of it. Bernie Moreno is the Trump endorsed candidate. Um, he seems to be the front runner, but at the last minute, Matt Dolan, who is a state senator and has picked up the endorsement of Governor Mike DeWine and former Senator Portman, has really surged in the last couple of days. He is now leading. He has led in the last couple of polls. Frank LaRose, the initial front runner, the Secretary of State of Ohio, has dropped to third place. And so this primary has really just devolved into madness. Moreno has a couple of scandals um, that have arisen in the last couple of days. It reminds me a lot of the just last minute, dare I say it, shit show that emerged from the Pennsylvania Senate GOP primary last cycle with Dr. Oz. And so even though like Ohio had a competitive primary in 2022 and Tim Ryan was a good candidate for the Democrats and he forced Republicans to spend money on JD Vance's Senate campaign, Ryan was not the incumbent. Like he was the best possible candidate that could have run because Brown, of course, was already, occupying this seat. There would have been no reason for him to run in that other election. But I mean, like this seems to be gearing up. We seem to be gearing up for an even closer primary this time. LaRose seems. I can't believe how much he's fallen. He was initially expected to be the front runner. I thought that he was going to be the GOP nominee initially. I never thought that Matt Dolan would be in first place. I figured that he would get a significant chunk of the vote, but he would come in third place initially. Bernie Moreno, after getting Trump's endorsement, really seemed to be the clear front runner, but now it's just Ohio just really seems to really be just tearing Republicans apart. And I think that's partially due to the fact that the national GOP did not decide to intervene in this Senate primary, unlike in other states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. We'll talk about Montana in a little bit. But overall, even though Trump is going to win this state by a lot, and I know that the Democrats are often overestimated in Ohio polling, but in 2022, it seemed like the polls actually were pretty accurate, honestly. I think the polling average for um, JD Vance had him up by like 8 points. He actually underperformed the polling data in the last couple of um, in by election day. So I think Ohio, honestly, and remember these are the same polls, the ones that show Sherrod Brown winning, are the same ones showing Donald Trump defeating Joe Biden by what by reasonable amounts, like plausible amounts, given what we know about Ohio's electorate. But yeah, you can kind of see here this was higher than Vance's 6 point margin in the state. 538 was the closest one in terms of the actual margin. So I wouldn't even say I would, put a little bit more weight behind these polls. Democrats have been underestimated in polling data recently, in the last couple since 2022, and that seems to be continuing as we saw with the New York's with the special election on Long Island for George Santos' seat last month. So overall, I think that Brown actually right now is favored to win narrowly. I think he's going to win by a little less than a point. This could very much change, but right now, just this Senate primary for the Republicans, it was going to be messy from the beginning. I had no doubt about that. I mean, it was a freeway race. It was going to be interesting, but the last couple of days and these polling numbers, which I know polls are not everything, as I just said, they are wrong sometimes. And I do think Moreno is going to come out of this with an advantage. JD Vance was underestimated in the Republican primary in 2022 by the final polling average, but just this last minute scramble has really kind of gone crazy. The Dolan surge reminds me of Kathy Barnett's surge in Pennsylvania's GOP primary last cycle, and how just frantic this primary race has become. It's going to be very close, but I think Moreno is going to come out on top narrowly. Um, by how much, I don't know, and I think Dolan has a chance. Maybe LaRose actually does end up doing a little bit better than the polls are expecting, but I think right now it's really Moreno versus Dolan at this point. It really shows how much Senate primaries can change in just a little bit of time. Anyways, let's keep going. Texas, I'm going to put in the lean GOP column. It's a left trending state. Ted Cruz is not a very popular incumbent. He had a scare in 2018 when he almost lost to Beto O'Rourke. Um, and Democrats, I think Joe Biden's going to lose. I think I'm still putting um, Texas in the presidential cycle as a lean red state, but just barely. I think it'll be like a 4 to 5 point victory for Trump. For Cruz, I think he does a little bit worse against Colin Allred, who's the Democratic candidate um, for Senate. Texas actually held their primaries on Super Tuesday. Cruz won the primary overwhelmingly. Big surprise. Democrats had a sort of contested primary, but Allred still won overwhelmingly. He was the front runner from the beginning, and I think he's a decent candidate. The polls that show Trump winning Texas comfortably against Biden show Cruz and Allred in a dead heat. Um, or with show the race to be really close. So I think that this race really is. I think Texas is left trending. It has a shot of going Democratic if everything goes wrong for Cruz and for the national Republicans. Um, but I think Democrats really, the Senate map is just so awful for them in terms of the amount of seats they have to defend. Um, they're going to do better than a conventional than the map itself at face value suggests. But Texas, they're going to be distracted by other Democrats are going to be distracted by other states. So I think it's going to be hard for them to win this state. So that gets Republicans to 50. And so that would mean if they do win the presidency, they have already won the chamber. But currently, I think Joe Biden is favored to win re-election. We have these free races left. We're going to go to Arizona next. Kirsten Sinema has finally announced or has finally made her decision on whether or not she's going to run for re-election. The answer is no, and I'm honestly not surprised. I figured the longer that her silence went on, the more confident I became that she was going to not run for re-election. I think initially it made a lot of sense because she had changed to be an independent to kind of screw over Democrats for backing or encouraging Ruben Gallego, who's the presumptive Democratic nominee, to run against her in the Democratic primary. And she was clearly going to lose that based on polling data. I mean, just look at this. She was not even getting like 20% of the vote in some of these polls back in 2022. And so I think that she really wanted to get Democrats to get behind her, but or risk losing this state and making it and drawing away votes so the Republican would win. Carrie Lake is the presumptive GOP nominee. I think that she's honestly the worst Senate candidate for Republicans this cycle. The NRSC has gotten behind her with the hopes of uniting the Arizona GOP. And Lake, to be fair, has tried to moderate her rhetoric since her 2022 gubernatorial campaign. But honestly, I think she's already alienated enough voters where they're just not going to buy it. They're not going to buy her sudden change of heart. Ruben Gallego, while pretty progressive, is still not. He's not the worst candidate for Democrats. I think he's proven himself to be a pretty formidable candidate. And honestly, the freeway race matchup with Cinema still showed um, her pulling away votes from both parties, sometimes more from Republicans, sometimes more from Democrats, but overall, Gallego was still leading in most of these polls. And now that she's out of the race, I think that makes the odds even better for Democrats now that it's a one-on-one race, a Democrat versus Republican race. So I think Gallego does win by around 2 to 4 points, I want to say. Um, Yeah, I think that Arizona, it's a pretty left trending state, has become even more of a battleground since 2016, when Trump won it by only 3.5 points, and then in 2018 voted for the Democrats won a Senate race there. Kyrsten Sinema did. Um, the first Democratic victory for in Arizona in a Senate race since the 1980s. So pretty historic, victory for Sinema, and just how much the perception of Arizona voters of her has changed in the last 6 years. Really, no one would have expected what had happened to happen, but that's politics. Um, and so Ruben Gallego, I think, right now is the favorite. Of course, this is a competitive race, but nonetheless, Carrie Lake's just an awful candidate. But Republicans are going to nominate her. Um, she has a primary opponent, I think, Mark Lamb, who wouldn't be much better of a candidate. But honestly, just either way, I think she's the worst candidate this cycle, for the Republicans. And I think that she'll be an even worse candidate this time around because of her refusal to accept the election results, her loss in the governor's election last cycle, than she was when she was running for governor last cycle. Um, Now we go to Nevada, which is going to vote for Jackie Rosen most likely. Um, she defeated a Republican incumbent, Dean Heller, in 2018 by a comfortable margin. Nevada almost always votes for Democrats. It's always very close, but the polls always overestimate Republicans. And despite Republicans' best efforts to win this state, they haven't won a Senate race here since 2012. And while they have a decent candidate in Sam Brown, who's likely to be the GOP nominee, one of the better candidates this cycle, um, who has an inspiring backstory, I think Rosen just is she's a very strong candidate. She's proven herself to be formidable. And Nevada's a very polarized state. I think that honestly, Rosen does better than Biden. I think most Senate Democrats, honestly, the Senate Democratic candidates will do better than Joe Biden's performance in these battleground states, especially in Ohio and Montana, and we'll get to Montana in just a second. But in Nevada, of course, Rosen, very decent incumbent, running in a typically light blue state. Can't it always can go red, but the um such a stubbornly Democratic state that I really have a hard time putting it in the Republican column. Brown is a decent candidate, but again, um, I think it's just all the factors, everything is pointing to a Rosen victory right now. Nevada is just stubbornly Democratic. And I think a lot of people just underestimate that. So then we go down to the final state. Democrats are at 49, Republicans are at 50. Um, Montana is going to decide the Senate majority. Matt Rosendale the last month, Matt Rosendale announced his run for U.S. Senate, withdrew, decided to run for re-election to the House, and now is not even running for re-election to his House seat. He is retiring from the House. He got scared off after Tim Sheehy earned Donald Trump's endorsement. Republicans were able to avoid nominating Rosendale, who seemed at one point inevitable to win the nomination. But Rosendale, he waited too long to announce his campaign. He pulled a Ron DeSantis, if you want to put it. And he was losing to Tim Sheehy in these polls, and he was not. He took forever to announce his widely expected campaign, and Republicans got behind Sheehy. So while Sheehy is not the best candidate, I think that he does not have the one thing that Rosendale does have that Sheehy doesn't is name recognition, or higher name recognition, um, and of course, political experience. But I think he's less controversial. That doesn't mean that scandals won't come out about him. I'm sure that almost every candidate in politics is going to have a scandal alleged against them, especially the ones that are just very mysterious and kind of don't have a lot of previous political experience. John Tester is a very strong incumbent. He's won three competitive races before, each time by very narrow margins, and Republicans have gone after him every time. And but And while it's a smaller state, which means that crossover, that like the vote margins for, or like, think about it like this. Um, I'm trying to put this into perspective. I know this video is very long. I apologize for that. But I just wanted to really get into detail about all these states. Um, uh, One vote in Montana, which is a smaller state than Ohio, has more sway over the overall margin. So Tester doesn't need to win as many crossover voters as Sherrod Brown does in Ohio. However, Trump's going to win the state by around 16 points, and Tester only overperformed the Democratic nominee for House by like 7 points, or the Democratic nominee for House in 2018 by like 7 points. Like I think the Republicans won the Montana at-large House seat by like 4 points in 2018. Yeah, or 5 points. And Tester won by around four, so that's about a 9 point difference. I think he'll overperform Biden by more than that here, but overall, I think it's just going to be really hard for Tester to overcome the polarization that is inevitable in a presidential election year. It's not impossible. He's done it before. But I think right now I give the race to Sheehy. And so even if Democrats do win the presidency, Republicans do win, according to my prediction, an outright majority. They win 51 Senate seats to Democrats' 49. Republicans hold on to their competitive seats in Florida and Texas, as well as picking up West Virginia and Montana, while Democrats hold on to Arizona, technically, I mean, Sinema does caucus with the Democrats, but that's besides the point. Still a Democratic victory. Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Maryland, as well as Virginia. So, yeah, that is where I stand right now on these Senate races. Despite my best efforts, I still cannot get this video to be less than 40 minutes. This might be even longer than the last one. And for the record, I did actually make notes to follow. So yeah, because I did take into account your guys' feedback, and I wanted to make sure that I was not just kind of spitballing it, because that usually takes longer. But I don't know. I'm kind of depleted of energy today. Hopefully, I can get these videos to be closer. Um, yeah, or to be shorter. So thank you all so much for watching. Let me know what you guys think about these Senate races. I want to hear your opinions. Do you think Democrats are going to win? Do you think the Senate majority? Do you think Republicans are going to win? Do you disagree with me on any of these races? I'm really curious to hear all of your thoughts. So yeah, thank you all so much for watching. If you liked the video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Check out my non-political channel, Interactor127. Yeah, I'll see you guys next time when I talk about all things politics. See ya.